She stood in the center of his mahogany-lined office, clutching the strap of her cheap canvas tote, and told the most dangerous man in the city that she was going out with someone else. He didn't shout. He didn't reach for the weapon undoubtedly holstered beneath his tailored suit. He merely pulled a silver lighter from his pocket, sparked the flint, and lit a cigarette. That silence was louder than a gunshot, and infinitely more terrifying. The air in the room was stale, thick with the scent of leather, aged bourbon, and the quiet, heavy authority that Dominic Mercer carried in his bones. Outside, the city wept, rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office. Inside, the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of a vintage grandfather clock. Nora Gallagher stood perfectly still. Her boots were damp from the walk over, leaving 2 dull, wet smudges on the immaculate Persian rug. She wore a faded beige trench coat, the belt knotted haphazardly at her waist, her hair pulled back into a messy clip. She looked entirely out of place in the opulent, dimly lit room. She always did. Yet, for the past 4 years, this room had been the anchor dragging her down into the dark. She swallowed hard, tasting the bitter metallic tang of her own anxiety. "I have a date tonight." The words dropped from her mouth like stones onto glass. Dominic didn't flinch. He didn't stop reviewing the leather-bound ledger open on his desk. For a long, agonizing moment, he didn't even acknowledge that she had spoken. He was a man who traded in patience. He ran the unions, the docks, the unspoken, violent underbelly of the city, all with the quiet, suffocating pressure of a deep-sea trench. Slowly, Dominic closed the ledger. The dull thud echoed in the massive room. He leaned back in his leather chair, the leather creaking slightly under his weight. His dark eyes, flat, unreadable, entirely devoid of the fiery rage a lesser man might show, lifted to meet hers. He reached into the inside pocket of his charcoal suit jacket. Nora's breath hitched, just a fraction. It was an instinct, a survival mechanism honed over 4 years of watching men walk into this room and never walk out. But Dominic didn't pull a weapon. He withdrew a single, unbranded cigarette and placed it between his lips. Next came a heavy, silver Zippo. Cluck. Psh! The flame illuminated the sharp angles of his jaw, the slight, almost imperceptible tightening of a muscle in his cheek. He inhaled deeply, the tip of the cigarette glowing a violent, angry orange in the dim light. He snapped the lighter shut and dropped it onto the mahogany desk. It landed with a heavy, final sound. He exhaled a long, slow plume of grey smoke, letting it drift between them like a physical barrier. He said absolutely nothing. Nora shifted her weight, the silence pressing against her eardrums until they rang. "His name is Simon," she offered, her voice betraying a slight tremor she hated herself for. "He's a high school teacher. We're getting dinner at 7. Why was she explaining herself? She was his accountant, his problem solver, the woman who took his dirty numbers and made them clean. She wasn't his property. She wasn't his wife. They had never shared a bed, never shared a kiss, never shared anything more than the suffocating tension that crackled between them whenever the door closed. Dominic took another drag. The cherry of the cigarette burned down, turning to fragile grey ash. He held her gaze. It was a terrifying gaze. It didn't demand obedience, it simply assumed it. It stripped away her defiance, leaving her feeling exposed, naked beneath the heavy wool of her coat. "A teacher," Dominic finally said. His voice was gravel and smoke, pitched low, devoid of inflection. "Yes." "Does he know what you do for a living, Nora?" The question was a quiet devastation. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. It was a reminder of the permanent, indelible stain on her soul. "He knows I work in finance," she said, keeping her chin up, though her hands were shaking so badly she had to bury them deep in her coat pockets. "He knows I crunch numbers. That's all he needs to know." Dominic tapped his cigarette against the edge of a heavy crystal ashtray. A clump of ash fell into the glass. People who only know half the truth are usually the first to die from it. "I'm just going to dinner, Dominic. It's Friday night. I've finished the offshore transfers. The accounts are clean. I am going out. For pasta. With a normal man." The desperation in her voice was pathetic, and she knew it. She was begging for permission from a man who believed he owned the very air she breathed. Dominic leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. The smoke curled around his dark hair. He studied her, categorizing her frayed edges, her tired eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw. He saw right through the bravado. He saw the exhausted 30-year-old woman who just wanted to pretend for a few hours that she wasn't tethered to a monster. "Wear the blue dress," he said quietly. Nora blinked, the air rushing out of her lungs. "What?" "The navy one. Silk. You wore it to the charity gala last year." He took a final drag of the cigarette and crushed it out in the crystal tray, twisting it until the ember died completely. "It suits you. If you're going to pretend to be someone else tonight, Nora, you might as well look the part." He picked up a gold fountain pen and reopened his ledger, dismissing her completely. Nora stood there for 3 seconds, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wanted to scream. She wanted to sweep the heavy ashtray off his desk and watch it shatter. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked out, the heavy oak doors clicking shut behind her, sealing him away. But as she stepped into the elevator, she realized her hands were still shaking. He hadn't said no. But Dominic Mercer never had to say no to get exactly what he wanted. The restaurant was a cozy, mid-tier Italian place in a neighborhood that hadn't yet been gentrified into sterile luxury. It smelled of garlic, roasting tomatoes, and warm bread. It was loud. It was chaotic. It was magnificently, beautifully normal. Nora sat in a booth near the back, wearing the navy silk dress. She hadn't wanted to wear it. She had pulled out a dozen other outfits, throwing them onto her bed in a fit of quiet rebellion. But in the end, the silk had slipped over her skin like armor. Across from her sat Simon. He was exactly as he had appeared on his dating profile. Kind eyes, thinning brown hair, a slightly crooked smile that felt genuine. He wore a tweed jacket with patches on the elbows, a cliché he seemed entirely comfortable with. "So the kids actually staged a walkout over the cafeteria food," Simon was saying, chuckling as he buttered a piece of bread. "I couldn't even be mad. They organized it beautifully. Spreadsheets, petitions, the whole 9 yards. I told the principal, 'Look, civic engagement is up. Let's call it a win.'" Nora forced a smile, bringing her wine glass to her lips. The house red was acidic, burning the back of her throat. "That's wonderful. Did it work?" "They got the sloppy joes removed, which I consider a victory for humanity," Simon laughed. He looked at her, his eyes warm, admiring. "You seem 1,000,000 miles away, Nora. Bad week in finance?" "Something like that," she murmured. "You must deal with a lot of stress, balancing books, market fluctuations. I admit, numbers put me to sleep, but I respect the grind." He had no idea. He thought her stress came from fluctuating interest rates, not from scrubbing millions of dollars of extortion money through dummy corporations in the Caymans. He didn't know that if she made a single rounding error, men ended up in the harbor. "It's just a job," she said, cutting her ravioli with a little more force than necessary. "Well, you deserve a break, and I have to say, "You look stunning tonight." Nora felt a flush of guilt. Simon was decent. He was the kind of man who would remember anniversaries, who would want to adopt a rescue dog, who would worry about his cholesterol. He was everything she had wanted when she was 22, before her father's gambling debts had landed her in Dominic Mercer's ledger. She took a deep breath, determined to be present. "Tell me more about the school, Simon. How long have you—" "Excuse me, sir, madam." The maitre d' materialized at their table. He was an older, nervous-looking man in a tight suit. He carried a bottle of wine, not the cheap house red Nora had ordered, but a heavy, dark, dust-covered bottle that looked older than she was. "Compliments of the house," the maitre d' said, his voice a little too tight, his eyes avoiding Nora's directly. Simon looked pleasantly surprised. "Wow, really? What's the occasion?" "A gesture of appreciation for our valued patrons," the man stammered, quickly uncorking the bottle and pouring a measure into 2 fresh, crystal glasses he had produced from a tray. "Please enjoy." He vanished before Simon could ask another question. Simon picked up his glass, swirling the dark liquid. He took a sip and his eyebrows shot up. "Good Lord, I don't know much about wine, but this tastes like a car payment. Cheers to us, I guess." Nora didn't touch her glass. She stared at the label. Chateau Margaux. 1996. It was Dominic's favorite vintage. A cold sweat broke out across the back of her neck. She looked around the restaurant, the boisterous family in the corner, the couple arguing quietly by the window. It all looked the same. But the air had changed. It felt heavier. The illusion of safety had shattered in an instant. He wasn't here. She knew that. Dominic Mercer didn't slum it in family-style trattorias. But he didn't need to be here to ruin this. He just needed to remind her of the leash. "Nora, are you all right? You look pale." Simon's brow furrowed in genuine concern. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice tight. "Just a sudden headache. I'm going to step into the restroom for a moment." "Take your time." She stood up, her knees slightly weak, and navigated through the crowded tables toward the back hallway. The hallway was dimly lit, the walls lined with cheap prints of the Italian countryside. The music from the dining room was muffled here. She pushed open the heavy wooden door to the women's restroom, walked over to the sink, and gripped the cold porcelain. She stared at herself in the mirror. The navy blue dress clung to her perfectly. Her chest heaved. "He's not here," she told her reflection. "It's just a bottle of wine. It's a mind game." She splashed cold water on her wrists, trying to steady her racing pulse. She took 3 deep, ragged breaths. She was an adult. She was going to go back out there, finish her date with a nice man, and go home to her empty apartment. She dried her hands with a rough paper towel, threw it in the bin, and pushed the restroom door open. Standing in the narrow, shadowed hallway, leaning casually against the brick wall beneath a flickering sconce, was a man in a tailored charcoal suit. Nora stopped dead. The air trapped itself in her lungs. It wasn't Dominic. It was Thomas, Dominic's chief enforcer, a man whose quiet demeanor masked a horrifying capacity for violence. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring at his phone, idly scrolling. When he heard the door shut, he glanced up. He offered her a polite, entirely terrifying nod. "Evening, Miss Gallagher," Thomas said, his voice a soft, low rumble. "Boss wanted to make sure the food was to your liking." Nora's hands balled into fists. "Tell him the food is fine, Thomas. Tell him to call his dogs off." Thomas pocketed his phone. He didn't smile, but there was a flicker of pity in his dead eyes. "You know I can't do that, Miss Gallagher. The boss just wants to ensure you get home safely tonight. I'll be in the black sedan across the street when you're ready." He didn't make a threat. He didn't mention Simon, he just stated a fact. Nora walked past him, her heart turning to lead in her chest. As she stepped back into the dining room, she looked at Simon, who was happily eating his ravioli and drinking a $4,000 bottle of wine he didn't understand, bought by a monster he couldn't comprehend. The date was over. It had never really begun. Nora slid back into the booth. The leather squeaked beneath her, a mundane sound that grounded her just enough to keep her from unraveling. Simon was smiling, blissfully ignorant, cutting into a piece of garlic bread. He poured her a glass of the vintage wine. The dark liquid caught the dim light, looking entirely too much like old blood. She picked it up. She took a sip. It was complex, earthy, and perfectly aged. It tasted like ash in her mouth. "You okay?" Simon asked, pausing with his fork halfway to his mouth. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I think the stress of the week just caught up with me," Nora lied smoothly. It was a terrifying realization, how easily the deception rolled off her tongue. 4 years with Dominic Mercer had taught her how to lie without a twitch. "I'm getting a migraine, the really bad kind." "I'm so sorry, Simon, but I think I need to call it a night." Simon's face fell, but he nodded immediately, his concern genuine. "Of course, don't apologize. Let me get the check and I'll drive you home." "No." The word came out, too fast, too sharp. Nora softened her tone, forcing a weary smile. "No, thank you. You stay, finish the meal, enjoy the wine. I'll just grab a cab. I really just need a dark room and some quiet." Simon frowned, clearly wanting to argue, but her rigid posture stopped him. He reached across the table and squeezed her hand. His skin was warm, dry, normal. "All right, but text me when you get in. Let me know you're safe." Safe. The word echoed in her skull, hollow and mocking. "I will. Thank you for understanding." She grabbed her coat, not bothering to put it on, and walked out of the restaurant. The cold night air hit her lungs like a physical blow. The rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle, slicking the pavement and catching the glare of the street lights. She stood on the curb and looked across the narrow street. Parked in the shadows between 2 flickering street lamps was a sleek, black Lincoln Town car. The engine was running, a low, menacing purr that vibrated through the damp air. The driver's side window was rolled down exactly 2 inches. She couldn't see Thomas, but she could see the faint red cherry of his cigarette glowing in the dark interior. Nora didn't hail a cab. She didn't walk toward the subway. She crossed the street, her heels clicking a sharp rhythm against the wet asphalt, and yanked open the back door of the Lincoln. She slid into the leather seats. The doors locked automatically with a heavy, solid thud. The interior smelled of expensive leather, stale smoke, and the faint, metallic tang of gun oil. Thomas shifted into drive without looking in the rearview mirror. "Home, Miss Gallagher." "Don't play games with me, Thomas," Nora snapped. Her hands were shaking again, but this time it was pure, unadulterated rage. The fear had burned away, leaving a white-hot fury in its wake. "Take me to him." "The boss gave strict orders to see you safely to your apartment. Take me to the club, now." Thomas drove in silence for 3 blocks. The wipers squeaked against the windshield, smearing the neon lights of the city into blurred streaks of color. Finally, he merged into the left lane and took the ramp toward the warehouse district. Nora leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, her eyes fixed on the passing city. The anger was a living thing inside her, clawing at her ribs. She was 26 when she walked into Dominic's office to beg for her father's life. A pathetic, terrified girl with a degree in accounting and a mountain of debt that wasn't hers. Dominic hadn't killed her father. He had simply absorbed the debt. And in return, he had absorbed her. She became his personal ghost, She untangled his finances, hid his money in a labyrinth of shell companies, and kept the feds off his back. She was paid obscenely well. She lived in a high-rise. She drove a nice car. She was the highest-paid prisoner in the city. The Lincoln pulled up to an unassuming brick building near the docks. There were no signs, no bouncers at the door, just a heavy steel reinforced door and a camera tucked into the eaves. Thomas put the car in park. "He's in the back office." Nora didn't wait for him to open her door. She shoved it open, stepped out into the rain, and marched toward the entrance. The lock clicked open with a heavy electronic buzz before she even reached for the handle. They were expecting her. She walked down the narrow concrete hallway. The muffled thump of bass grew louder as she passed the double doors leading into the underground casino. But she didn't turn. She headed straight for the heavy oak door at the end of the corridor. Two large men in dark suits flanked the entrance. They stepped aside seamlessly as she approached, their eyes fixed on the floor. They knew better than to look at Nora Gallagher when she was moving with purpose. She didn't knock. She grabbed the brass handle, twisted it, and shoved the door open with enough force that it banged against the wall stop. The room was vast and heavily shadowed, illuminated only by a brass desk lamp and the dull ambient light of the city bleeding through the frosted windows. The air was thick with the scent of Dominic's cigar smoke and the sharp bite of whiskey. He was sitting behind his desk, pouring a measure of amber liquid into a crystal tumbler. He didn't flinch when the door slammed. He didn't even look up. He set the decanter down, picked up the glass, and took a slow, deliberate sip. "I expected you an hour ago," Dominic said. His voice was calm, scraping against the silence like sandpaper on hardwood. Nora marched across the room and stopped 2 feet from his desk. "Did you really think a bottle of wine and a babysitter would just send me scurrying home?" "It seems to have sent you exactly where I wanted you." Dominic finally looked at her. His dark eyes swept over her, taking in the damp hair sticking to her cheeks, the flushed skin of her neck, the navy silk dress that clung to her frame. There was no apology in his gaze. There was no guilt. There was only a cold, possessive certainty that made Nora's stomach twist. "You ruined my night," she said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, quiet register. "You humiliated me. You sent Thomas to stalk me." "I sent Thomas to protect my investment," Dominic corrected, leaning back in his chair. "You are holding the financial architecture of my entire organization in your head, Nora. You don't get to have casual dinners with high school teachers who make 40 grand a year and talk about cafeteria food." "You were listening?" The violation hit her like a slap. "You bugged the table?" "I own the restaurant." Nora stared at him. The wind knocked out of her sails. He owned it. Of course he did. He owned half the neighborhood. He owned the air she breathed. "Simon is a good man," she managed to say, her voice tight. "He's normal. He's safe." "He's a liability," Dominic countered seamlessly. "He's a man who doesn't understand violence. What happens when one of the rival families realizes who you are? What happens when the Russians decide they want to squeeze me by taking my accountant? What is Simon going to do, Nora? Teach them algebra?" He set his glass down on the desk with a sharp clack. The sudden sound made her jump. Dominic stood up. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and deeply intimidating. The tailored suit didn't hide the dangerous, coiled energy beneath it. He walked around the edge of the heavy desk, closing the distance between them. Nora held her ground, refusing to step back, even as her instincts screamed at her to retreat. He stopped a few inches from her. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough to smell the bergamot and cedarwood of his cologne, mixed with the sharp scent of tobacco. "You think this is a game?" Dominic said softly, looking down at her. "You think you can clock out at 5 and go play house in the suburbs? You can't." You crossed a line the day you walked into my office and asked me to spare your father. I paid that debt, she fired back, tilting her chin up to glare into his eyes. I've paid it 10 times over. The accounts are clean. Your money is untraceable. I've done everything you asked. It's not about the debt anymore. The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded. Nora's breath hitched. She stared into his dark, fathomless eyes, searching for a crack in the armor, a glimmer of the humanity he worked so hard to bury. Then what is it about, Dominic? Why won't you let me go? He didn't answer immediately. He raised a hand, his large, rough fingers brushing against the side of her neck. The touch was agonizingly gentle, entirely at odds with the violence he commanded. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, catching a stray, damp curl of her hair and tucking it behind her ear. A shiver racked her spine, completely betraying her defiance. She hated herself for it. She hated that his touch felt like a drug she was desperately trying to quit. Because out there, you're a target, he murmured, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. Because a man like Simon will look at you and see a pretty woman with a stressful job. He won't see the grit. He won't see the shadows. He won't know how to survive the dark. Dominic stepped closer. The toes of his leather shoes brushed against hers. But I do. He leaned in, his lips a breath away from her ear. You belong in the dark, Nora. You just haven't admitted it yet. He pulled back, his expression returning to an unreadable mask of authority. He dropped his hand and turned away, walking back to his desk. The spell broke, leaving Nora feeling cold and exposed in the middle of the room. Go home, Nora, he commanded quietly, not looking at her as he sat back down and picked up his pen. Thomas is waiting outside. You have the quarterly reports to finish by Monday. She stood there for a long moment. She had marched in here to demand her freedom, to scream at him, to break something. But he had dismantled her with logic, fear, and a single, devastating touch. She turned and walked toward the door, her hand wrapped around the brass knob. And Nora? She paused, not looking back. Don't wear that dress for anyone else ever again. Nora walked out, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind her. The click of the latch sounded like a vault ceiling shut. She was still trapped. But as she walked down the concrete hallway toward the waiting Lincoln, she realized with a sickening twist in her stomach that part of her didn't want to leave. Saturday morning broke over the city in a wash of miserable grey light. Nora's apartment was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the relentless drumming of rain against the glass. The navy silk dress lay pooled on the hardwood floor near the foot of her bed, discarded the moment she had walked through the door at 2 a.m. It looked like a bruise against the pale oak. She sat at her kitchen island, a mug of black coffee growing cold beside her laptop. Her hair was pulled into a severe knot. She wore oversized sweatpants and a faded college t-shirt. She was trying to scrub the scent of cedarwood and stale tobacco from her memory, but it clung to her. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Simon. Hey, hope the migraine passed. Let me know if you need anything. Soup delivery. Advil? Nora stared at the glowing screen. She felt a profound, sickening wave of guilt. Simon was decent. He was safe. And because of that, she could never reply. She swiped the notification away and powered the phone down completely, tossing it onto the sofa. She turned her attention back to the glowing spreadsheets. Numbers made sense. Numbers didn't touch her jaw in the dark. Numbers didn't send enforcers to Italian restaurants. In the architecture of finance, everything balanced. Every debit had a credit. Every action had an equal, measurable reaction. Until they didn't. Nora paused, her finger hovering over the trackpad. She frowned, leaning closer to the screen. She was reviewing the quarterly transfers from the union pension fronts, moving the skimmed percentage through a web of shell corporations in the Caymans before filtering it back into legitimate real estate holdings. It was a closed loop. It was her masterpiece of criminal accounting. But there was a tear in the loop. A $450,000 tear. Her heart kicked into a slow, heavy rhythm. She ran the macro again. She traced the routing numbers back through the digitized ledgers. The money had exited a holding firm in Nassau, but it hadn't arrived at the development fund in Chicago. It had been diverted, funneled into a defunct logistical company registered in Belize. Someone was stealing from Dominic Mercer. Nora pushed away from the island, the stool scraping loudly against the floor. The air in the apartment suddenly felt very thin. Stealing from Dominic wasn't just a crime, it was a suicide note. She didn't want to know this. She wanted to hit delete, close the laptop, and walk away. If she reported this, blood would spill. Real blood. Not the metaphorical kind she scrubbed from the ledgers. But if she didn't report it, and Dominic found out, she would be complicit. She was the architect. She was the one holding the keys. She walked to the window and looked down at the rain-slicked streets far below. The city looked small from up here, detached. It was an illusion. She turned back, grabbed her coat, and shoved her laptop into a bag. An hour later, a cab dropped her off at the edge of the shipping yards. The docks were a jagged skyline of rust-colored cranes and stacked shipping containers, flanked by the churning, slate-grey water of the harbor. The wind howling off the water was brutal, carrying the smell of diesel exhaust and rotting kelp. Dominic's black Lincoln was parked near Pier 44. Thomas stood, leaning against the hood, the collar of his wool coat turned up against the wind. He didn't look surprised to see her. He simply nodded and gestured toward a corrugated metal warehouse 50 yards away. Nora clutched her bag to her chest and walked toward the building. The heavy metal door was ajar. Inside, the warehouse was vast and echoing, smelling of damp cardboard and machine oil. Dominic stood near a folding table in the center of the cavernous space. He wasn't wearing his tailored suit today. He wore dark jeans, a thick charcoal turtleneck, and a heavy peacoat. He was speaking quietly to two men in heavy work boots and leather jackets. When Nora's heels clicked against the concrete, the conversation stopped. The two men looked at her, then immediately looked at Dominic. Dominic didn't smile. He gave a fractional nod to the men, who quickly stepped away, disappearing into the shadows of the stacked crates. He turned his full attention to Nora. "You look awful," he said, his voice carrying easily over the sound of the wind rattling the metal roof. "Good morning to you too," Nora snapped, shivering as the damp cold seeped through her trench coat. She walked up to the folding table and slammed her laptop down onto the metal surface. "I thought you needed the weekend to recover from your traumatic exposure to vintage wine," Dominic said, stepping closer. Nora didn't take the bait. She opened the laptop, her fingers flying across the keys to wake it up. "We have a problem. A real one." The mild amusement vanished from his eyes, replaced instantly by the cold, calculating stare of a predator. He stepped up beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost brushed. "Show me," he demanded softly. Nora tapped the screen, pulling up the highlighted route. "Nassau account 382, the union skim from the Southside Development Project. It was supposed to transfer to the Chicago real estate holding on Thursday at midnight. It didn't. It bounced through 3 dummy servers in Geneva and landed here." She pointed to the final destination, Belize. A shell company called Apex Logistics. It's been defunct for 6 years. Dominic stared at the screen. He didn't speak. He didn't move. The silence stretched, tight and dangerous, like a wire pulled to the breaking point. How much? He finally asked. 450,000. Dominic slowly turned his head to look at her. The proximity was overwhelming. She could see the faint shadow of stubble on his jaw, the tiny flecks of gold hidden in his dark irises. Is it a glitch? He asked. Numbers don't glitch, Dominic, Nora said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Algorithms do what they are told. Someone built a back door into my routing protocol. Someone with top-tier access. Who? I don't know yet, but I can find out. Dominic looked back at the screen, the muscle in his jaw feathered. Do it. The cramped office attached to the back of the warehouse was barely larger than a closet. It smelled intensely of old paper and bleach. A single space heater hummed in the corner, glowing a fierce, artificial orange. Nora sat at a battered metal desk, her laptop plugged into a secure terminal. Dominic stood directly behind her, his large frame blocking the only exit. His presence was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Every time she shifted, her elbow brushed against the rough wool of his peacoat. For 2 hours, the only sound in the room was the frantic clatter of her keyboard. She was reverse engineering the back door. It was sophisticated work, elegant in its deception. Whoever had done this understood her coding. They understood the rhythm of the organization's cash flow. They knew precisely when she would be distracted by the larger quarterly transfers. They used a ghost key, Nora murmured, rubbing her tired eyes. A mirrored login. It bypassed the two-factor authentication by spoofing Thomas's IP address from the downtown office. Thomas isn't smart enough to write code, Dominic stated flatly. I know, but whoever did this needed physical access to his terminal to clone the MAC address. Nora's fingers flew across the keys, pulling up security logs from the downtown servers. Lines of code cascaded down her screen like green rain. She isolated the timestamp of the clone. Tuesday, 11:45 p.m., she cross-referenced the building's digital keycard swipes. At 11:45 p.m. on Tuesday, only 3 people had been on the executive floor. Thomas, Dominic, and one of his capos. Nora stopped typing. Her hands hovered over the keyboard. Her mouth went dry. You stopped, Dominic noted. His voice was right by her ear, low and rough. What did you find? Nora swallowed hard. She didn't want to turn around. She didn't want to look at him, because she knew what giving him this name would mean. It wasn't accounting anymore. It was an execution. Nora! His hand clamped down on her shoulder. The grip was firm, unyielding. Tell me. She slowly swiveled the chair around to face him. His eyes were completely devoid of warmth. This was the man who owned the city. This was the monster Simon could never comprehend. It was Arthur, she whispered. Dominic's expression didn't change. Not a flinch, not a blink. Arthur Cleary had been with the organization for 15 years. He had run the Southside docks since Dominic took power. He was a trusted lieutenant. Are you sure? Dominic asked. It wasn't a threat. It was a demand for absolute certainty. I tracked the digital fingerprint. Arthur swiped into the executive floor at 11:42 p.m. He logged into Thomas's terminal at 11:45. He injected the backdoor script, cloned the authorization key, and was back in the elevator by 11:51. He initiated the transfer from his own phone on Thursday night. The IP matches his cellular provider. Dominic stared at her for a long, terrible moment. Then he let go of her shoulder. He pulled his phone from his pocket, hit a single speed dial button, and lifted it to his ear. Thomas, Dominic said. The calmness in his voice was horrifying. Pick up Arthur. Take him to the meatpacking plant on 9th. Do not let him make any calls. He hung up. Nora shot out of the chair, her knees knocking against the metal desk. "Dominic, wait. What are you doing?" "What needs to be done?" he replied, sliding the phone back into his coat. "You can't just—" She choked on the words. She had known what would happen. She had known the rules. But the reality of it, the clinical efficiency of the violence, paralyzed her. "He's been with you for over a decade. Maybe he has a reason. Maybe he's in trouble. He stole $500,000 from my organization, Nora. He compromised my security, and he compromised you." Dominic took a step toward her, closing the distance she had just tried to create. "In my world, you don't get points for having a good reason to betray your family." "I just gave you a name," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "I just ran the numbers. I don't want his blood on my hands." Dominic stopped. The coldness in his face cracked just a fraction. He reached out and grabbed both her arms, hauling her forward. He didn't hurt her, but the grip was absolute. He forced her to look up into his eyes. "Listen to me," he commanded, his voice vibrating with a sudden, fierce intensity. "You are not just a calculator. You are the wall that keeps this empire from burning to the ground. Arthur didn't just steal money. He breached your system. He put a target on your back." Nora's breath hitched. She stared at him, terrified by the raw violence swimming in his gaze, but entirely unable to pull away. "If the feds found that back door, they would have traced it to you," Dominic said, his grip tightening slightly. "If a rival family bought that access from Arthur, they would know how to cripple me. And they would start by taking you." He leaned down, his face inches from hers. The heat of his breath washed over her skin. "I am not killing Arthur because he took my money. I am killing him because he put you in danger." Nora froze. The words echoed in the cramped, humming room. He hadn't said it to manipulate her. He had said it as a cold, undeniable fact. "You wanted to know why I won't let you go," Dominic whispered, his eyes dropping to her lips for a fraction of a second before snapping back to her eyes. "Because you are mine to protect. And out there, with your school teachers and your cheap wine, you are entirely defenseless." He let go of her arm so abruptly she stumbled back against the desk. "Pack up your equipment," he ordered, turning his back on her and pulling the heavy door open. The roar of the docks flooded back into the room. "We're leaving." "Where?" Nora asked, her voice trembling. Dominic paused in the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking the grey light. "To clean up Arthur's mess. You're going to reroute the money. And I am going to make sure no one ever thinks about touching your ledgers again." He walked out into the rain. Nora stood in the suffocating heat of the office, staring at the empty doorway. She was trembling, but it wasn't from the cold. It was the terrifying realization that Dominic Mercer didn't just own her debt. He owned her survival. And God help her, part of her felt safer in his shadow than she ever had in the light. The meatpacking plant on 9th Street was a brutalist block of windowless concrete. It didn't look like a place of business. It looked like a tomb. Nora walked through the side entrance, her boots slipping slightly on the damp, chemical-washed floor. The air inside was atrocious. It tasted of ammonia, rust, and the metallic tang of extreme cold. The hum of industrial freezers vibrated through the soles of her shoes, a relentless, teeth-rattling drone that made it impossible to think. Thomas was waiting by a heavy, insulated door. He looked completely unbothered, checking a pocket watch with the casual air of a man waiting for a bus. He nodded to Dominic, then glanced at Nora. For the first time in 4 years, she didn't see pity in his eyes. She saw a grim, terrifying respect. "He's in the main locker," Thomas said, his voice barely audible over the mechanical hum. tied to the drain grate. He's talking, but it's mostly apologies. Set her up in the foreman's office, Dominic ordered, not breaking stride as he moved toward the heavy door. He didn't look back at Nora. He simply walked into the freezing abyss and let the heavy door slam shut behind him. Thomas led her up a narrow flight of grated steel stairs to a small, glass-walled office overlooking the floor. The glass was frosted over with age and grime, blurring the expansive room below into muddy, indistinct shapes. "Lock the door behind me, Miss Gallagher," Thomas said, setting a space heater on the desk and plugging it in. "Don't look out the window, just look at the screen." He left. The lock clicked into place. Nora sat down in the cheap, vinyl office chair. It squeaked, a pathetic, high-pitched sound in the heavy silence of the room. She opened her laptop. The screen flared to life, casting a harsh, blue light across her pale face. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the cold metal of the desk, forcing herself to breathe. Just look at the screen. She pulled up the routing protocols. The Belize account was still sitting there, fat with $450,000 of stolen union money. Arthur's retirement fund. Arthur's death sentence. Nora began to type. She didn't write code to steal, she wrote code to vanish. She constructed a new digital tunnel, routing the funds out of Belize, pinging them off a server in Frankfurt to wash the origin point, and then funneling them quietly into the legitimate Chicago real estate ledger. Down below, a heavy, dull thud echoed through the concrete walls. Nora flinched, her fingers slipping off the home row of the keyboard. She squeezed her eyes shut. She tried to imagine Simon's face. She tried to remember the smell of garlic bread and the sound of a crowded restaurant. It slipped away like water through her fingers, replaced by the suffocating smell of ammonia. Another thud. Then, a sharp, echoing crack that sounded entirely too much like breaking bone. She opened her eyes and stared at the glowing lines of code. She typed faster, her keystrokes becoming frantic, aggressive strikes against the plastic keys. She was drowning out the sounds. She was building a wall of numbers to hide behind. Execute transfer. The progress bar appeared. 10%, 30, 60. A muffled shout breached the glass. It wasn't a word. It was just a raw, tearing sound of human agony. Nora shoved her chair back, clamping her hands over her ears. She squeezed her eyes shut, dragging oxygen into her burning lungs. She wasn't innocent. She had never been innocent. But there was a massive, horrifying canyon between knowing men died for this money and sitting 20 feet above the execution. A sharp beep from her laptop cut through the panic. Transfer complete. Balance. The door handle rattled. Nora scrambled to her feet, knocking the vinyl chair backward as the door swung open. Dominic stood in the threshold. He had taken off his peacoat. His heavy charcoal turtleneck was pushed up to his elbows. He looked exactly the same as he had an hour ago, except for the erratic, heavy rise and fall of his chest, and the dark, wet smear across his knuckles. Nora backed up until her spine hit the filing cabinet. She couldn't tear her eyes away from his hands. Dominic stepped into the room and closed the door. He walked over to a small, industrial sink in the corner of the office, turned the faucet, and began washing his hands with a bar of gritty, orange soap. He scrubbed methodically, silently, watching the pink-tinged water circle the drain. "Is it done?" he asked. His voice was perfectly level. "Yes," Nora choked out. Her throat felt lined with sandpaper. "The money is in Chicago. The Belize account is scorched. There's no trace." Dominic turned off the water. He dried his hands on a rough paper towel, tossed it in the bin, and turned to look at her. He saw the terror in her eyes, the rigid, defensive posture of her body. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell her it was going to be okay. He walked across the small office and stopped right in front of her. He reached out, taking her trembling face in his large, clean hands. His palms were freezing. "Breathe, Nora," he commanded quietly. She gasped, a fractured, sobbing intake of air. "You killed him. I removed a threat to my business, and I removed a threat to you." His thumbs smoothed over her cheekbones, anchoring her in the present, forcing her to look at him. "Do not weep for a man who would have gladly let you take the fall." "I'm not weeping for him," she whispered, a rogue tear spilling over her lashes. "I'm weeping for me. Because I did the math. I pulled the trigger just as much as you did." Dominic's eyes darkened. He leaned down, resting his forehead against hers. It was an incredibly intimate, shocking gesture. "Welcome to the dark, Nora." The drive back to the city was completely silent. The adrenaline that had sustained Nora through the warehouse had entirely evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, aching exhaustion. She leaned her head against the cool leather of the Lincoln's back seat, watching the neon city lights bleed through the rain-streaked windows. She expected Thomas to drop her off at her apartment building. She craved the isolation of her own four walls, the sterile safety of her kitchen island. But the car didn't turn toward the residential district. It glided smoothly into the subterranean parking garage of a massive, black glass high-rise downtown. Dominic's building. Nora sat up, a fresh spike of panic cutting through her fatigue. "What is this? I want to go home." "You aren't going to your apartment," Dominic said, stepping out of the car. He opened her door, offering a hand she refused to take. "Arthur had men loyal to him. Until I know they are all accounted for, you are staying with me." "I can take care of myself. You said the threat was neutralized." "I said Arthur was neutralized. I do not take half measures with your safety." He leveled a look at her that brooked absolutely no argument. "Upstairs." Now, she was too tired to fight. She climbed out of the car, clutching her laptop bag like a shield, and followed him into the private, keycard access elevator. The doors slid open to reveal a penthouse that spanned the entire top floor. It was a masterpiece of cold, modern design. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying, panoramic view of the rain-drenched city. The furniture was black leather, brushed steel, and dark, polished wood. It felt less like a home and more like a fortress disguised as a luxury suite. "Leave the bag," Dominic said, shrugging off his coat and tossing it over the back of a sofa. He walked toward a sprawling wet bar in the corner. "What do you drink?" "I don't want to drink. I want to know when I can leave." He ignored her, pulling 2 heavy crystal tumblers and a bottle of expensive dark amber bourbon. He poured 2 generous measures and walked back, holding one out to her. Nora stared at the glass, then at him. She took it. The crystal was heavy and cold. Dominic took a slow sip of his own drink, watching her over the rim of the glass. "You can leave when I say it's safe, which means you will work from here on Monday. I will have Thomas retrieve whatever clothes you need. You can't just lock me in a tower, Dominic." She took a desperate swallow of the bourbon. It burned like fire going down, warming the icy knot in her chest. "My debt is paid. The ledger is clean. You said it yourself in your office." "I did. Then let me go." The plea was genuine, but it sounded fragile, even to her own ears. "Fire me. Let me go back to a normal firm. Let me date boring men who complain about cafeteria food. Let me pretend tonight never happened." Dominic set his glass down on the glass coffee table. The soft clink echoed in the massive room. He walked toward her, his movement slow and deliberate, cornering her against the edge of the sprawling leather sofa. "You think you can just walk away?" he asked, his voice dropping into that dangerous, gravelly register. "You think you can take 4 years of my secrets, my codes, my blood, and just carry it into a suburban neighborhood? You think a man like Simon will look at your hands and not see what they've done? Don't bring him into this. He was never in this. He was a prop, a desperate attempt to convince yourself you haven't changed." Dominic was standing inches from her now. The sheer physical presence of the man was overwhelming. "But you have changed, Nora. You didn't flinch when you rerouted that money. You didn't hesitate. You knew exactly what it meant. And you did it anyway." "I did it because I was terrified of you," she fired back, her voice shaking with unshed anger. "You did it because you are exactly like me," he countered seamlessly, his dark eyes stripping away all her defenses. "You just hide your violence behind a keyboard. I don't." He reached out, taking the half-empty glass from her trembling hand and setting it on the table. He didn't step back. "Your debt was paid a year ago," Dominic said softly. The words hit her like a physical blow. The air rushed out of her lungs. "What?" "The principal, the interest, the penalties. Your father's slate was wiped clean 13 months ago." Nora's mind reeled. She stared at him, trying to comprehend the magnitude of the lie. 13 months? You let me keep working. You let me think I was still working it off. "I doubled your salary," he pointed out calmly. "I don't care about the money," she shouted, shoving hard against his chest. It was like pushing a brick wall. He didn't budge an inch. "You kept me trapped. You lied to me." Dominic caught her wrists, his grip firm but careful not to bruise. He pulled her hands down, stepping even closer, forcing her to tilt her head back to look at him. "I kept you because I needed you," he said, the absolute sincerity in his voice more terrifying than any threat. "I kept you because without you, the architecture fails. And I kept you because you belong to me. Not by debt, by design." He released her wrists, his hand sliding up her arms to cup her face once more. The heat of his palms was a stark contrast to the freezing terror in her veins. "Simon is a ghost, Nora," Dominic murmured, his thumb tracing the trembling line of her bottom lip. "This is the only reality you have left. Stop fighting it." He didn't kiss her. He didn't have to. The possession in his touch, the absolute, undeniable claim he was staking, was a branding in itself. He stepped back, picking up his drink, leaving her shivering in the wreckage of her illusions. "Drink your bourbon, Nora. It's been a long night." The storm broke sometime near dawn. Sunlight, sharp and blindingly clear, sliced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, pooling on the dark hardwood floors. Nora woke in the guest room, tangled in sheets that smelled of expensive laundry detergent and cold air. She didn't move for a long time. She simply stared at the ceiling, listening to the distant, muted hum of the city traffic far below. 13 months. The number cycled through her mind, a rhythmic, agonizing pulse. For 13 months, she had walked into his office, balanced his books, and laundered his blood money, believing she was buying her life back ounce by ounce. And all the while, the cage door had been wide open. She just hadn't bothered to push it. She sat up. Her navy silk dress was draped meticulously over the back of a velvet chair in the corner. Someone, Thomas likely, had brought it in while she slept in the oversized t-shirt she had found in the dresser. She didn't put the dress on. She pulled on a thick white cashmere robe from the closet, tying the belt tightly around her waist, and walked out of the room. The penthouse was achingly quiet. The smell of dark roast coffee drifted from the sprawling, state-of-the-art kitchen. Dominic was sitting at the massive marble island. He was freshly showered, wearing crisp black slacks and a white dress shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. A tablet lay flat on the counter next to his coffee mug. He was scrolling through a digital ledger. The sheer normalcy of the scene was violently jarring against the memory of his blood-stained knuckles the night before. He didn't look up as her bare feet padded across the hardwood, but he pushed a secondary, empty mug toward the center of the island and nudged a silver carafe beside it. Nora walked to the island. She didn't speak. She poured the coffee, the dark liquid steaming in the chilly air of the apartment. She wrapped both hands around the ceramic mug, letting the heat seep into her skin, and looked at him. "Did Arthur have a family?" she asked. Her voice was scratchy, devoid of the panic from the previous night. It was a sterile, logistical question. Dominic swiped a page on his tablet. "A brother in Portland. We wired him a severance package this morning through the shell account you built last year. He won't ask questions." A severance package. Blood money. Pain money. Nora took a slow sip of her coffee. It was bitter, strong, and perfectly brewed. "You told me I belonged to you by design," she said, setting the mug down. The clink of ceramic against marble sounded like a gavel. "You told me you kept me because the architecture fails without me." Dominic finally looked up. His dark eyes locked onto hers, reading the subtle shift in her posture, the hardening of the lines around her mouth. He didn't say anything. He waited. "If that's true," Nora continued, her voice gaining traction, dropping the fragile, victimized tone she had carried for 4 years. "Then I am not a hostage. I am a partner." Dominic leaned back in his stool, resting his forearms against the edge of the marble. A faint, dangerous shadow of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "A partner. 13 months ago, my debt was cleared. I am no longer working for my father's life. I am working for this empire." She gestured to the tablet, to the invisible empire sprawling out beneath the glass windows. "And if I am staying, the dynamic changes. I don't get locked in towers. I don't get babysat by Thomas. If I am the architect of your money, I demand a seat at the table." She was terrified. Beneath the heavy cashmere robe, her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. But she held his gaze. She was crossing a threshold, stepping over the corpse of the woman who had gone on a date with Simon the school teacher, and stepping into the shoes of the woman who had rerouted $500,000 while a man was broken to pieces below her. Dominic studied her. He saw the calculation in her eyes. He saw the sharp, brutal intellect that he had weaponized, finally turning back on him with demands of its own. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly satisfied. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the unbranded cigarette and the heavy silver Zippo. He placed the cigarette between his lips. Clack. Fsh. He lit it, snapping the lighter shut. The smoke drifted lazily toward the high ceiling. But this time, he didn't set the lighter down on the counter. He held it in his hand, the silver catching the morning light. "You want a seat at the table?" Dominic murmured, taking the cigarette from his mouth. "I want the control you owe me," Nora corrected smoothly. Dominic stood up. He walked around the kitchen island, his tall frame blocking the sunlight, casting her entirely in his shadow. He stopped in front of her. He reached out, taking her chin in his rough hand, tilting her face up. He didn't offer a warning this time. He lowered his head and kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It tasted of dark coffee, tobacco, and unapologetic possession. It was a collision, a brutal acknowledgement of the twisted, suffocating gravity that had been pulling them together for 4 years. Nora gasped against his mouth, her hands instinctively coming up to grip the crisp cotton of his shirt. She didn't push him away. She pulled him closer, kissing him back with a fierce, desperate anger that melted seamlessly into surrender. When he finally pulled away, they were both breathing heavily. His hand slid from her chin to the back of her neck, tangling in her messy hair, anchoring her to him. "You want control, Nora?" he whispered, his eyes entirely black, entirely hers. "Take it. The ledger is yours. The money is yours. I am yours." He pressed the silver lighter into the palm of her hand and closed her fingers around it. Nora looked down at the heavy metal in her fist. She was damned. She knew it with absolute, crystalline certainty. There would be no normal life. There would be no safety. There would only be the math, the money, and the monster standing in front of her. She looked back up at Dominic, slipped the lighter into the pocket of her robe, and reached for her coffee. "Good," she said softly. "Now, show me the offshore accounts." And that brings us to the end of Nora and Dominic's dark journey. If you found yourself holding your breath as Nora finally embraced the shadows, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. This kind of gritty, slow-burn mafia romance thrives on the morally grey choices. And I want to know your thoughts. Did Nora make the right choice by demanding her power, or should she have kept running? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who loves an unapologetic anti-hero, and I'll see you in the next story.